It is late evening in a great stone monastery in England some 700 years ago, and the world is very still. A single lamp burns in a long, low room, and the air smells of dried herbs and warm beeswax. Somewhere down the cloister, a bell has just rung for the last office of the day, and now there is only quiet. And the slow, careful work of tending the sick is about to begin again, as it does every night. Good evening, and welcome back to the Sleepy Archive. Tonight, we are going to drift very gently into the world of medieval medicine. The herbs and the honey, the lances and the leeches, the strange flasks held up to the candle, the brutal and sometimes surprising ways that people once tried to mend a broken body. We will sit beside quiet monks in their infirmaries and wise old women in their cottages, and barber-surgeons with their bright steel tools, and watch them do the patient work of healing. None of it is urgent. None of it is loud. It is just history told slowly, the way it might have happened on any ordinary night. As always, there is nothing here you need to do. You don't have to follow the story, or hold the names, or stay awake until the end. If your thoughts wander off, let them. If you lose the thread, that is perfectly fine. This is the kind of telling you are allowed to fall asleep inside. So, settle in. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Let the blankets feel heavier. Let your breathing slow and lengthen and soften. Whenever you are ready, close your eyes. Let's begin. The room where we begin is called the infirmary, the place of healing in a great medieval monastery. It is a long, low hall, set a little apart from the rest of the buildings, quiet and well kept. Down each wall stands a row of narrow wooden beds, each with its straw mattress and its rough grey blanket, and a small window above each one, shuttered now against the cold of the coming night. A monk moves slowly down the row, a lamp in one hand, pausing at each bed to look on the sleeper there. He is the infirmarian, the brother charged with the care of the sick, and this is his quiet kingdom. The floor beneath his sandals is swept clean and strewn with fresh rushes and a little dried lavender, so that the air smells less of sickness and more of the herb garden just beyond the wall. At the far end of the room, there is a small fire in a stone hearth, and a kettle hung above it, and a long table crowded with the tools of his craft, the bowls and the cloths and the little clay pots. Bunches of herbs hang drying from the beams, rosemary and sage and feverfew, gathered in the warm months, and the smell of them mingles with the wood smoke and the warm wax of the single burning lamp. To us, all of this might look like a place of suffering, a room of the sick, far from home. But to the monks who tended it, the infirmary was a place of mercy and of careful, patient work. For the rule of their order told them plainly that the care of the sick came before all things, that in the sick and the weary they were to see and to serve something holy. And so the infirmarian went on down the row, bed by bed, lamp in hand, straightening a blanket here, laying a cool hand on a hot brow there, murmuring a low word. The fire settled in the hearth. The herbs swayed faintly on their strings in the draught, and the long night of healing settled over the quiet infirmary, as it had for 100 years. Among all the cures the monks kept, there was one that was simple and gentle and good. For an open wound, a cut or a graze, or a sore that would not close, they reached for honey, plain honey, the same that sweetened their bread, gathered from the bees in the monastery garden. It seems too humble a thing to be a medicine, a jar of honey, golden and thick and slow. But the monks had watched it work year after year, and they trusted it, and they were right to. A wound dressed with honey, they had found, festered less and healed cleaner and pained the man less. They did not know why. They could not know why, in an age long before such things were understood. But honey, we know now, draws the water out of the small living things that spoil a wound, and so it quietly keeps them from growing and gives the flesh beneath a clean and peaceful place to mend. So the infirmarian would take a clean linen cloth and spread the honey thick upon it, and lay it gently over the wound, and bind it round, and change it each day for a fresh one. The man in the bed would feel only a faint, cool sweetness and a slow easing of the soreness. Sometimes the monks mixed the honey with other things, with herbs or with a little wine, into a salve they kept in a small covered pot upon the long table by the fire. But often the honey alone was enough, and the simplest cure was the best one they had. It is a quiet thing to think on, in the warm dark, that a jar of honey from a garden hive, spread on a cloth by a patient monk 700 years ago, was a true and a working medicine. The bees made it, the brother spread it, and slowly under the linen the torn flesh knit itself whole. Behind the infirmary, sheltered by a low stone wall, lay the herb garden, the heart of the cure. It was a square of dark earth, divided into neat beds by little paths of trodden gravel, and in those beds grew the plants that the monks used to heal, each one in its own place, known and named. This was the physic garden, and it was as carefully tended as any field of corn. The monks weeded it and watered it and gathered from it in the right season, in the cool of the morning. For they knew that a herb gathered at the wrong time, or dried too fast, lost much of its virtue. Here grew sage, grey-green, and pungent, good for the mouth and the throat, and the easing of grief. Here grew rosemary, sharp and clean, thought to quicken the memory and to lift a heavy spirit. Here grew feverfew, with its little white daisy flowers, taken for aches in the head, and mint and rue and comfrey with its broad leaves, called knitbone, for the mending of breaks. Some of these we still trust today, and some we have set aside, but all were used in earnest. The monk who kept the garden knew each plant by sight and by smell, and what each was good for, and which part to use, the leaf or the root or the flower, and how to dry it and how to keep it. In the warm months, he would gather the herbs in armfuls and carry them into the infirmary and hang them from the beams to dry, and grind them and steep them and store them away in pots, so that in the deep of winter, when nothing grew, the shelves were still full of green virtue. The garden slept now in the dark, the beds quiet under the night sky, the herbs heavy with dew. But all that grew there in the summer sun was kept and saved and waiting to do its slow work upon the sick. There was, among the old recipes, a drink the monks kept for the worst of pains. For a man who must lie still through a long agony or face the surgeon's knife, they had a draught. They called it duale, and it was made to bring on a deep and merciful sleep. It was a strong brew and a dangerous one, and the monks made it with great care. Into it went the juices of certain plants, of poppy and of henbane, and of hemlock, and others besides. These were mixed with wine or with the gall of a boar, and warmed and given to the sick man to drink. Now these were perilous plants, and well the monks knew it. Too much, and the sleep would never end. So They measured by long habit and by the recipes handed down, and they watched the sleeper closely. The man would drink and grow heavy, and his eyes would close, and the pain would loosen its grip. And while he slept, the surgeon could do his work, the setting of the bone or the lancing of the sore, and the man would feel less of it, or none at all, and wake later, sore but whole. It was a true medicine for pain, made from poisons, balanced on a knife's edge by patient hands. To wake him, there was another recipe, a wash of vinegar and salt rubbed upon the face, to draw him slowly back up out of the deep, dark sleep and into the waking world again. It was crude and it was risky, but in an age with little else, it was a real mercy. So the brothers kept their dwale in a stoppered flask upon the high shelf, away from careless hands. A sleep made out of poison, measured drop by careful drop, to carry a suffering man through his worst hour. Not all the monks' cures were gentle. Some were hard, and some were terrible to bear. Among the harshest was the cautery, the use of a hot iron laid upon the flesh to heal by burning. It sounds a cruel thing, and it was a fearsome one, but it had its reasons, and it often worked. The iron was a slender rod with a rounded or a pointed tip, kept by the fire and heated until it glowed. And for certain ills, it was pressed briefly and firmly against the skin of the suffering man. To stop a wound from bleeding, to close a deep cut, to burn away a festering sore that would not mend. The reasoning was old, and it was not foolish. A hot iron seared the flesh shut in an instant, and it stopped the flow of blood at once, where cloth and pressure might fail to. And in sealing the wound with fire, it left behind it clean, dead skin that the rot could not enter. It was, of course, a dreadful pain. The monks knew this, and so the dwale was given first where it could be, and the man was held firm by strong hands, and the iron was laid on swiftly, and lifted swiftly away. There was a hiss and a smell best not lingered on, and then it was done, and the worst was over. The brothers used the iron sparingly for the gravest cases where gentler cures had failed, but used so, it saved lives that would otherwise have bled away or rotted slowly into death. A brutal cure, plainly, and yet in its harsh way a sound one, and sometimes the only one that served. The iron, cooling now, was set back by the hearth, its work done for the night. And the man it had healed slept on, bound and dressed. The bleeding stopped, the danger past, alive. It was not only the herbs and the irons that healed in that quiet hall. It was the care itself. For the infirmarian's first task, before any cure, was simply to tend the sick man well, to keep him warm and clean and fed, and to sit with him through the long watches of the night. This was no small thing in an age when most of the sick had no one to tend them at all. The monk brought broth, warm and nourishing, and held the cup to the lips of those too weak to lift it. He washed the fevered and turned them in their beds so the sores would not come, and kept them dry. He aired the room and swept it, and changed the soiled linen, and strewed fresh herbs upon the floor. He knew that a clean, warm, quiet room was itself a kind of medicine, though he had no word for why. And the body, given rest and warmth and good food and gentle care, will often mend itself. Much of the monk's success, if we may call it that, came simply from this patient tending. The sick who came to them were sheltered and fed and rested, where alone they might have died. And many recovered who would not have recovered, not from any single cure, but from the whole of the care. The infirmarian did this work year upon year as a duty and as a prayer. He rose in the night when a man cried out, and came with his lamp and his cool hand and his low voice. He sat by the dying when there was nothing left to do, so that no man should die alone in the dark. It was slow work and humble work, and most of it has left no record at all. But it was perhaps the truest medicine the monastery had, not a herb nor an iron, but a patient brother who stayed. And now the long hall settles into the deep of the night. The fire in the stone hearth has sunk to a low red glow, and the kettle hangs cold above it. The herbs sway faintly on their strings. The shutters are fast against the dark. The sick lie quiet in their narrow beds, each under his rough grey blanket, breathing slow. The man with the honeyed wound, the man the iron healed, the man drawn down into his dwale sleep. All of them tended, all of them resting, all of them safe within these old stone walls. The infirmarian sits at the end of the room by the dying fire, his lamp turned low. He has made his last round of the beds and found all as it should be, and now he keeps his watch. His hands are still in his lap. His eyes are heavy. The night is long and the quiet is deep. Outside, the cloister is dark, and the garden of physic sleeps under its blanket of dew. The bell will ring again in the small hours, calling the brothers to their prayers in the cold church. But for now, there is only this: the low fire, the sleeping sick, the patient watcher by the hearth, and the smell of herbs and honey and warm wax hanging soft in the still air of the healing hall. The infirmary holds its quiet and its mercy and its small store of green and golden cures until the morning. Far from the great stone monastery, in a small village among the fields, there stood a low cottage. It was a humble place of wattle and daub under a roof of thatch, with a single room and an earthen floor. But to the folk of that village, it was as important as any infirmary, for here lived the wise woman. She was the village healer, the woman everyone went to when sickness came, or pain, or trouble. She had no learning from books, for she could not read, and she had never seen a physician. But she knew the herbs of the hedgerow and the wood, as well as any monk knew his garden. Her cottage was dim and warm, lit by a low fire in the center of the floor, the smoke drifting up to a hole in the roof. From the rafters hung her store of dried plants, bunch upon bunch, gathered through the long, warm months. And on a rough shelf stood her pots and crocks, her oils and her ointments, her small hoard of cures. The folk came to her with everything, with coughs and fevers and aching joints, with burns and cuts and stings, with sick children and birthing mothers, and old men whose chests rattled in the winter cold. She listened to them all and looked at them with her shrewd old eyes and reached for her herbs. Her knowledge was old, far older than she was, passed down from mother to daughter through the years. A whole memory of healing, never written, carried in the heads of women like her all across the land. What worked and what did not, which leaf for which ill, how much and when and how to make it. She was no witch, whatever the fearful sometimes whispered. She was a healer, plain and practical. And on this cold evening, she sat by her low fire, her herbs hanging dark above her, waiting, as she always waited, for the next knock at the door and the next soul in need of mending. The first to come that evening was a woman with a child whose chest was tight and rattling. The little one coughed and wheezed and could not draw an easy breath, and the mother was afraid. The wise woman looked at the child and listened to its breathing and knew at once what to do. She would make a poultice, a warm, soft mass of herbs to lay upon the chest to ease the cough. She took dried mustard and ground it fine and mixed it with flour and a little warm water, working it in a wooden bowl into a thick paste, the sharp smell of it rising as she stirred. She spread the paste upon a square of clean cloth and folded the cloth over it so it would not burn the skin. Then she laid it, warm, upon the small chest and bound it gently in place with a strip of wool. The warmth of it spread slowly, and the mustard drew the blood up to the surface and eased the tightness within. It was a real remedy, and it worked in its quiet way. The warmth comforted and loosened and soothed, and the mustard, drawing the blood to the skin, helped to ease the deep ache of the laboring chest. The child grew calmer under the warm cloth, and its breathing slowed, and the worst of the fit passed. The wise woman gave the mother more of the dried mustard, wrapped in a twist of cloth, and told her how to make the poultice again, warm and fresh, each evening until the cough was gone. And she gave her too a little honey to mix with warm water and a herb for the child to sip. The mother thanked her and gathered up her child and went out into the cold dark toward her home. And the wise woman turned back to her fire and her herbs and set the bowl aside to be washed. A warm cloth, a sharp herb, a little honey, small things and humble, and yet enough to ease a child's hard night. Not all of the wise woman's cures were herbs and poultices. Some were words and charms and old sayings. For she lived in an age that did not draw a hard line between the medicine of the body and that of the spirit. And so, beside her herbs, she kept a store of charms, old rhymes to be said over the sick. For a bleeding wound, there were words to be murmured, an old verse to stop the flow of blood. For a fever, a charm to be whispered, perhaps written on a scrap and worn about the neck. For a child that would not thrive, a saying passed down from her own grandmother, said 3 times over. We may smile at this now, but it was not foolishness, and it was not always useless. For a frightened soul, calmed by an old and trusted rhyme, is a soul more likely to mend. And the wise woman, saying her charm with quiet certainty, gave her people something to hold to. She would lay her hand upon the sick and say the old words low, in a steady, unhurried voice, and the sick would feel in the saying that something was being done, that they were not alone, that an old and knowing power was set gently against their fear and their pain. Often the charm went hand in hand with the true remedy, the herb and the word given together. The poultice laid on, and the rhyme said over it, the draught poured out, and a blessing breathed upon it. So the body and the mind were tended at once, and who is to say the second did not help the first? The wise woman believed in her charms as she believed in her herbs, with a plain and untroubled faith. They were part of her craft, handed down with all the rest, tried and trusted over the long years. And in the dim warm cottage by the low fire, the old words and the old herbs did their work together. Upon her shelf the wise woman kept a pot of salve, a thick green ointment of her own making. It was her cure for many ills at once, for cuts and burns and chapped skin and aching joints, and she made a fresh batch of it each year in the warm season, when the herbs were green and full. To make it, she gathered her healing plants, the ones she trusted best for the mending of the skin. There was plantain and yarrow and comfrey and the broad, soft leaves of certain other herbs. She bruised them and chopped them fine and steeped them slowly in warm fat or oil over the fire. For long hours the herbs would steep in the warm fat, giving up their green virtue into it, until the whole cottage smelled of it, sharp and green and earthy, and the fat ran dark with the herbs. Then she would strain it, pressing every drop through a cloth, and let it cool and thicken into salve. This she kept in a covered pot and drew upon all the year round for whatever hurt came to her door. A smear of it on a cut to keep it clean and help it close. A dab on a burn to cool and soothe it. A thick layer worked into a hand, cracked and sore from the winter cold and the hard, rough work. Some of the herbs in it truly helped, we know now. Yarrow, that slows the bleeding of a wound. Comfrey and plantain, that soothe the angry skin and help the torn flesh to knit. The old woman did not know the why of it, but she knew the salve worked, and that was enough. So the green pot sat upon her shelf, a small store of healing gathered from the summer fields. A humble, homely medicine, made by hand, smelling of the hedgerow, good for 100 small hurts. And the folk of the village trusted it, and came for it, and went away with a little of it in a leaf, and were the better for it. When a woman of the village came to her time, it was the wise woman who was sent for she was the midwife too, as the village healer so often was, and the bringing of children was her work. There were no doctors for such things. The birthing room belonged to the women, and to her above all. She would come in the night when the knock fell on her door, and gather her things and go. A clean cloth, a little oil, certain herbs to ease the pains and to quicken a slow labour. And she would settle by the labouring woman and stay with her through however long it took. She knew how to turn a child that lay wrong with her own two practised and gentle hands. She knew the herbs to give to speed a tired labour, and those to slow a bleeding after. She knew how to ease the mother with warm cloths and low words, and the steady comfort of her presence. It was hard and anxious work, and not always could it be saved, for birth was a perilous hour. Many a mother and many a child was lost in that age for all that any hand could do. But the wise woman's skill and her calm and her long experience saved more than would have been saved without her. When the child was born at last, she would wash it and wrap it warm and lay it on the mother's breast. And she would tend the mother too, and make her a warm drink of herbs, and see her settled and resting. And only then, when all was well, or as well as it could be, would she gather her things to go. She had brought half the village into the world, the old woman, with her own two hands. The grown men in the fields, the women at their spinning, the greybeards by their fires. All of them had first drawn breath under her care, in some dim cottage on some long ago night. The wise woman could not read a word, and yet she carried a great book in her head, a book of cures, unwritten, learned by heart over a lifetime, and learned by her mother before her, hundreds of remedies, the names of the herbs, the seasons to gather them, the ways to make and to use them. It was a living book, this memory of hers, and it changed a little with each healer who carried it. For each one added what she had learned, what she had seen work, and let fall what did not. So the knowledge was always being tried and tested and slowly bettered across the long generations. She knew which berry would purge and which would poison, and the line between the two. She knew the herb for the headache, and the herb for the heartache, and the herb to bring on sleep. She knew the signs of a sickness that would pass, and of one that would not, and when to send for the priest. This was knowledge of a real and hard-won kind, gathered not from study, but from long looking, from watching, year upon year, what helped the sick and what harmed them, and remembering it was not always right. There were errors in it, and old wrong ideas mixed with the sound ones. But much of it was true and good and useful, and it was very nearly all the medicine the poor had. For the physician with his learning was for the rich, and the monastery was far, and the wise woman was near. She was here in the village by her fire, and her cures were cheap or free, and given with a kind hand. And when she died at last, full of years, she would pass her book, her unwritten book, to a younger woman, murmuring the old remedies to her through the last long evenings, so that none of it should be lost. And so the knowledge lived on, passing from head to head down the years, never written, never quite forgotten. Among the wise woman's cures was one that the village prized above many others, a cure for the sleepless. For there were always those who lay awake in the night, their minds turning, unable to find rest. And to them she gave her herbs of sleep, the gentle ones that quieted the body and eased the mind. There was valerian, the root of it, dug up and dried, with its strange, heavy, earthen smell. There was the flower of the hop, and the leaf of the lettuce, and chamomile, sweet and soft. And there was lavender that she grew by her door, the smell of it alone enough to calm a restless soul. She would steep these in hot water into a warm and fragrant draught, and give it to the sleepless to drink. Or she would make a little pillow stuffed with the dried flowers to lay the head upon at night. The smell would rise, soft and warm, all through the dark hours, and ease the worried mind toward rest. These were true cures, gentle and real, and we use some of them still in our own quieter way. For the valerian root does calm, and the chamomile does soothe, and the lavender does ease. The old woman did not know the why of it. She knew only that her sleepless folk slept after. And there was comfort, too, in the very making of it. The warm cup pressed into the hands, the familiar smell, the knowing that something old and trusted was being done against the long dark. For half of sleeplessness is fear of sleeplessness, and a calmed mind is already halfway to its rest. So on this very night, perhaps, in some cottage in the village, a soul lay down with a lavender pillow and breathed in the soft, warm smell of the dried flowers, and felt the day's cares loosen and drift away, and sank slowly, gently, into the deep and dreamless sleep the wise woman's herbs had made. And now the wise woman's long evening of healing comes at last to its quiet end. The folk have all gone home through the dark, with their poultices and their salves and their twists of herbs. The fire in the center of the floor has sunk low, and the smoke drifts thin toward the hole in the thatch. She moves about her single room, slow and stiff with her years, putting her things to rights. The bowls washed and set by, the herbs straightened on their strings, the green salve covered on its shelf, the charm papers folded away in their little box, the fire banked down to embers for the night. She is tired, the old woman, as she is tired every night with the good tiredness of work well done. Her hands ache and her back aches, but she has eased much pain this evening, and that is enough. The chest of a child loosened, a wound dressed, a draught made for the sleepless, a village tended. She sits a while by the dying fire, her hands quiet in her lap, the herbs dark and fragrant above her. The cottage is warm and dim, and full of the green, earthy smells of her long lifetime's craft. Outside, the village sleeps, the cottages dark, the fields silver under a thin and distant moon. She will lie down soon on her own narrow bed and sleep her own untroubled sleep. And in the morning she will rise and gather more herbs and wait again for the knock at her door. For there is always more healing to be done in a village, in an age with so little else. The fire glows red and low. The thatch creaks faintly overhead. The night is deep and still. And the old wise woman sits on a moment longer in the warm dark of her cottage of cures. In the town, on a busy street, there stood a shop with a striped pole hung above its door. The red and the white of it, twisting down the pole, told all who passed what was sold within. For this was the shop of the barber-surgeon, who cut hair and trimmed beards, and let blood and more. It was a single low room opening onto the street, with a wide bench and a stout wooden chair. Along one wall hung his tools, bright and fearsome, on hooks and in a rack, each one in its place. Razors and scissors for the hair, lancets and knives for the surgery, basins and bowls, and clean white cloths. The barber-surgeon was a practical man, neither a learned physician nor a humble wise woman, but something between. He worked with his hands and with his bright steel tools on the bodies of the townsfolk who came to him. He could shave a man and cut his hair and pull an aching tooth and let his blood and lance his boils. The physician, with his learning and his Latin, thought such handwork beneath him and would not touch a knife. And so the cutting and the bleeding and the drawing of teeth fell to the barber-surgeon instead. He learned his trade not from books, but from a master, by long apprenticeship, watching and doing. His shop was busy, for his services were needed, and his prices were within the reach of common folk. A man might come in for a shave and leave with a tooth pulled and an arm bled, all in the one visit. The striped pole turned slowly above the door, red for the blood and white for the bandage, drawing them in. He was no gentle healer, the barber-surgeon. His work was quick and hard and often bloody, but it was real work and needful work, and much of it, for all its roughness, did genuine good. And so we step into his bright and busy shop, where the cures were swift and were not soft. The most common of all his arts, and the one most asked for, was the letting of blood. For the men of that age believed, with a deep and settled faith, that the body held 4 humours, 4 fluids that must be kept in balance, and that much sickness came from having too much of one. And the cure for too much, they reasoned, was simple: to let some of it out, to open a vein and bleed it. So men came to the barber-surgeon not only when they were sick, but to keep themselves well. A regular bleeding, in the spring perhaps, was thought to clear the body of its excess and its corruption. The barber-surgeon would seat his man and bind a band about his arm to make the vein stand up. Then, with a small sharp blade, a lancet, he would open the swollen vein with a quick and practiced cut, and the blood would flow dark and warm into a shallow basin held beneath, marked to measure the amount. He took a careful quantity, neither too little nor too much, judged by the man and the season and the ill. And when enough had flowed, he would loosen the band and press a cloth upon the cut and bind it. The man would rest a while, a little pale, a little light-headed, and then rise and pay and go. Most of this bleeding, we now know, did no good at all, and much of it did harm, weakening the sick. It was founded on a wrong idea, and the wrong idea held its grip for many long centuries. And yet, for a very few conditions, the letting of a little blood does, by chance, bring some relief. So even here, in this mistaken art, there was a thread of accident that sometimes helped. But mostly, it was the faith in it that did the work, the deep belief that one was being purged and cleansed. The basin filled with dark blood. The arm was bound. The man went out into the street, lighter and sure he was the better for it. There was another way to let blood, gentler than the blade, and stranger to our eyes, the leech. For where the lancet drew blood swiftly and in quantity, the leech drew it slowly and in small amounts, and it could be set just where the blood was wanted, on a place too tender for the knife. The barber-surgeon kept his leeches in a jar of water, dark, sleek things, sluggish and patient. And when a gentle bleeding was called for, he would lift one out and set it upon the skin. The leech would fasten and bite, so small a bite the man scarce felt it, and begin to drink. Slowly it would swell, drawing the blood, growing fat and dark over many long minutes. And when it had taken its fill, it would loosen of itself and drop away and be set back in its jar. The little wound it left would bleed a while longer, gently, and then be bound, and that was all. It was a soft and a quiet kind of bleeding, and far less of a shock to the body than the blade. And here, too, there was more sense than we might think, for the leech does a curious thing. In its bite, it gives off something that keeps the blood from clotting, and that thins it and eases its flow. So the leech, in some few cases, truly helped, easing a swelling or a bruise or a congested place. And the medicine of our own day has come, in time, to use the leech again for some such purposes. The old barber-surgeon, setting his leeches by long habit, was not so far wrong as we once thought. He would tend them carefully, his jar of leeches, feeding them, keeping them in clean water, for they were valuable and useful and a part of his trade, these small, dark, patient creatures. And many a townsman bore the little marks of their gentle biting, and was, in some real cases, the better for it. Of all the barber-surgeon's services, there was one that all men dreaded above the rest, the drawing of teeth. For there was no easing of the pain in the most of cases, and the work was brutal and swift. A tooth that ached past bearing must come out, and out it came, by main force and a strong arm. The man would be seated, and his head held firm by the surgeon's knee or by a strong assistant. And the surgeon would take up his tool, a fearsome thing of iron made to grip and to twist and to pull. He would fasten it upon the rotten tooth and brace himself and wrench it free in one hard motion. It was over quickly at least. A great wrench, a crack, a gush of blood, and the bad tooth was out. And though the pain of the drawing was sharp and sudden, it was less in the end than the long ache had been. For a tooth gone rotten could pain a man for weeks and rob him of his sleep and his food and his peace. So men bore the dreadful moment for the long relief that followed it, and counted it a fair trade. The surgeon would press a cloth upon the bleeding socket, and bid the man bite down and hold it. And he might give him a clove to set against the gum, or a herb to dull the soreness that remained. There was little gentleness in it, and no true remedy for the pain in that hard age. But the drawing of a rotten tooth was a real cure for all its brutality, and a needful one. For the rot left in could spread and fester and bring on a deep and dangerous sickness of the whole body. So the brutal pull, swift and bloody, did a genuine good, removing the source of the corruption. The man would go home with a gap and a sore jaw and a cloth pressed to his mouth. But the deep and grinding ache that had robbed him of his rest was gone and would trouble him no more. Among the commonest of the surgeon's tasks was the lancing of boils and swellings and gathered sores. For in an age of hard living and poor washing, the skin bred such things readily, painful and hot, and they would swell and redden and gather until they must be opened and let to drain. The surgeon knew the moment for it, when the swelling had come to a head, ripe and ready. Too soon, and the lancing did little good, and pained the man for nothing. But at the right hour, a swift cut with the sharp lancet would open it, and ease it all at once. He would steady the swollen place, and set the point of the lancet to it, and cut, quick and clean, and the gathered matter would flow out, and the dreadful tight pressure of it would loosen and ease. The relief was immediate and great, for a boil at its worst is a hard and a throbbing pain. Then he would press the place gently to draw out the last of it and clean it and dress it. A poultice, perhaps, to draw it further, laid warm upon it and bound and changed each day. And the wound, opened and drained, would slowly close and heal clean and trouble the man no more. This was sound work and good, and much of it is sound still in its plain principle. For a gathered sore must be opened and drained and kept clean to heal, as we know yet today. The surgeon, with his lancet and his warm poultice, did real and lasting good in such cases. He saw 100 such in a year, the boils and the swellings of the hard-living townsfolk. And he opened them and drained them and dressed them with a quick and practiced hand. And many a man and woman walked out of his shop eased of a fierce and grinding pain and grateful for the bright, sharp blade. When a man fell or was crushed or broke a limb at his labor, it was to the surgeon he came, for the setting of broken bones was among his arts, and a skilled one, and much needed in that hard world. A bone broken and left to itself would heal crooked and lame the man for the rest of his days. So the surgeon would feel along the limb with his hands to find the break and the way of it, and then, with a firm and steady pull, he would draw the bone straight and set the ends together true. It was a great pain, this setting, and the man would be given drink or held fast to bear it. Once the bone was set, it must be held so, unmoving, while it knit itself slowly whole again. And so the surgeon would bind it firm with splints, stiff strips of wood laid along the limb. And he would wrap it round with cloth, sometimes stiffened with egg or with clay, to hold it hard and still. Then there was nothing to do but wait and keep the limbs still for the long weeks of the knitting. The comfrey, the knit bone, might be laid upon it, the old herb trusted for the mending of breaks. And the man would rest and favour the limb, and slowly, beneath the splints, the bone would grow whole. This was true and skillful work, and the principle of it is the very same we use today. Draw the bone straight, set the ends together, hold it still, and let the body do its mending. The surgeon did not know the deep why of it, but he knew the how, and the how was sound. And so many a broken arm and leg, set true by his hands, healed straight, and served the man well after. Where, untended, it would have left him crippled and lame and a burden all his life long. The hard pull, the splint, the long still waiting, a brutal cure, and a slow one, and a true one. Let us pause a while among the tools themselves, hung bright and clean along the surgeon's wall. For he kept them well, his instruments, knowing his whole trade depended on them and on their edge. And there is a strange, quiet beauty in them, for all the fearsome work that they were made to do. There were the razors, fine and keen, for the shaving of beards and the cutting of hair. There were the lancets, small and sharp, for the opening of veins and the lancing of sores. There were knives of several shapes and probes, and the dreadful iron forceps for the drawing of teeth. There were the cauteries, the irons for burning, kept by the small fire ready to be heated. There were the basins, shallow and marked, for the catching and the measuring of blood. There were the splints, and the rolls of clean cloth, and the needles, and the waxed thread for stitching. He cleaned them after each using, wiping them, and he kept them sharp and free of rust. A clean, keen blade did its work quicker, and with less pain. And he knew it, and he took care. Though he knew nothing of the small unseen things that spoil a wound, his habit of cleanliness still helped. The tools hung in their order on the wall, catching the light from the open front of the shop. Steel and iron and bright-honed edges, the whole armoury of his rough and useful craft. A man might look on them with dread, knowing what they were for, and well he might. But each one had its purpose and its proper use, and in a skilled hand each did real good. The blade that frightened was the blade that healed, that drained the soul and set the bone. And the barber-surgeon kept them bright and ready, his bright steel tools, the means of all his mending. And now the busy day in the barber-surgeon's shop draws toward its close. The last of his customers has gone, the tooth drawn, the arm bled, the beard trimmed neat. The street outside grows quiet, the light fails, and the striped pole turns slow above the empty door. He cleans his tools one by one in the last of the day's light, and hangs them back upon the wall. The razors, the lancets, the forceps, the probes, each wiped, each in its proper place. He empties the basins, and rinses them, and folds the used cloths away to be washed. He bangs the small fire, and sweeps the floor of the day's cut hair and its few dark stains. And he sets the leeches jar upon its shelf, and looks to them that they have clean water for the night. The shop, by the last grey light, comes slowly back to order, ready for the morning's work. It has been a hard day, and a full one, of swift and bloody and useful work, pain eased, teeth drawn, bones set, blood let, sores opened and dressed and bound, rough mercies, all of them, given quick and plain to the common folk of the town. He shutters the front of the shop at last, and the bright tools gleam a moment in the dimming light. Then the dark comes down within, and the busy room falls silent, the day's labours done. Outside, the striped pole hangs still now, red and white, faint in the gathering dusk, and the barber-surgeon climbs to his bed above the shop, his hands tired, his work behind him. While below, in the dark and quiet room, the bright steel tools hang waiting on the wall for another day of cures. In a fine house in the town, up a narrow stair, there was a small room lined with books. It was warm and dim and quiet, and it smelled of leather and of ink and of old paper. This was the study of the physician, the most learned of all the healers of that age. He was a man of letters, the physician, schooled long years at the great universities. He had read the old masters, the Greeks and the Arabs in their Latin translations, and knew them well. He spoke of humours, and of the stars, and of the deep causes of things, in long and learned words. His study was his kingdom, and it was a place of thought, not of blood and bright steel. On his shelves stood the great books, heavy, leather-bound, clasped with brass, each one worth a small fortune. On his table lay his charts, and his papers, and his instruments, the strange tools of his thinking craft. He did not cut or bleed with his own hand, or pull teeth, or lance sores, as the surgeon did. He thought such handwork beneath his dignity and his learning, and he left it to lesser men. His work was to know the cause of a sickness, and to judge it, and to order the cure in words. The rich came to him, the merchants and the lords, for he was costly, and his learning was prized. They valued his long Latin, and his grave manner, and his deep talk of humours and of stars. Whether it healed them or no, there was comfort in the very learning of it, in being so gravely tended. So he sat among his books, in his warm, dim study, the wise and learned physician. A candle at his elbow, a great book opened before him, his charts spread out upon the table. And to him presently would be brought the most curious of all his instruments of judgment, the flask. The physician's chief means of judging a sickness was a thing that may seem strange to us now. He studied urine, for it was held in that age that the body's inner state could be read in the water it passed. And so the sick or their servants would bring to him a flask of it to be looked upon and judged. The flask was a special vessel of clear glass, shaped much like the bladder itself, round and clear, and into it the patient's water was poured and carried, sometimes for miles, to the physician's study. He would take it and hold it up to the light of the window or the candle and study it long and gravely. He looked at its color first of all, whether pale or deep, golden or red or dark. He looked at how clear it was, or how clouded, and whether anything floated or settled within. He marked its thickness, and he opened it, and even, it is said, judged its smell, and on occasion its taste. From all of this, he would draw his conclusions by the long rules set down in his great books. This color meant a fever, that cloudiness, a trouble of the inner parts, this tint, an excess of a humor. He had a wheel, a chart of many colors, against which to match the water and read its meaning. Much of this, we know now, told him little or nothing true about the sickness it was meant to reveal. The old rules were mistaken, founded on wrong ideas, and the reading of them led often astray. And yet, here and there, a thread of truth ran through it, for the water does change in certain ills. A sweetness in it might mark the sugar sickness, a deep red, some hurt within, a cloudiness, a fever. So the watchful physician, studying his flask, did now and then read something real and true. He would set the flask down at last and stroke his beard and give his grave judgment and name the cure. Beside the flask, the physician had another guide, and it hung framed upon his study wall, the chart of the stars. For he believed, as nearly all believed then, that the heavens governed the body and its ills, that each part of a man answered to a sign of the zodiac, and that the stars must be consulted in all things. He had his charts of the heavens, and his tables of the planets, and his instruments for reading them. And before he gave a cure, or let a vein, or chose the hour for a medicine, he would look to the sky. For the right cure, given at the wrong hour, under the wrong sign, was thought to do no good or harm. There was a figure he kept, drawn upon parchment, a man with the 12 signs marked upon his body. the ram upon the head, the bull upon the neck, the fishes upon the feet, and so on down. And he would not bleed or treat a part of the body while the moon stood in the sign that ruled it. So the choosing of the moment was half his art, the reading of the heavens for the favorable hour. When to give the draught, when to let the blood, when to gather the herb at its full virtue, all of it tied to the slow wheeling of the planets and the moon through the houses of the sky. It seems to us now a strange foundation for the healing of a sick man's body, and much of it plainly did nothing, the stars caring little for the color of a humour, and yet there was a kind of order in it, and a great body of careful, if mistaken, reasoning. And there was this, too, a patient told that his cure was timed to the very heavens, set great store by it. He believed, and his believing eased him, and a soul at ease is a soul that mends the readier. So the physician studied his chart of the stars, and chose his hour, and gave his cure with grave and learned confidence. At the very heart of the physician's learning lay one great idea, the theory of the 4 humours. For it was held that the body was made of 4 fluids, and that health was their balance, and that all sickness came from one of them rising too high or sinking too low within the man. There was blood, warm and moist, that made a man ruddy and cheerful and full of life. There was phlegm, cold and moist, that made him slow and calm and heavy and given to rest. There was yellow bile, hot and dry, that made him quick to anger and lean and full of fire. And there was black bile, cold and dry, that made him thoughtful and heavy-hearted and sad. In every man, they thought, these 4 were mixed, and the mixing made his nature and his health. A man well balanced was well and even tempered. A man whose humours strayed fell sick or strange. And so the physician's task was to find which humour was at fault, and to bring it back to balance. If there was too much of one, it must be drawn off by bleeding, or by purging, or by sweating. If there was too little, it must be built up by the right food, and the right warmth, and the right herb. Foods and herbs themselves were judged as hot or cold, moist or dry, and given to balance the man. It was a whole great system, complete and reasoned, and it held the medical mind for centuries. It was, we now know, almost wholly wrong, founded on a picture of the body that was not true. And yet it was not foolish. It was a serious attempt to make sense of sickness and to order the cure, and it did some good by chance and by side effect, for much of its advice was sound enough. Rest and good food and warmth and moderation and the easing of the troubled mind. The theory beneath was false, but the gentle care it counselled often by itself helped the sick man mend. The physician had one more art beside the flask and the stars, and it was the feeling of the pulse. For he would lay 2 fingers upon the wrist of the sick and feel the beating of the blood there, and from that quiet beat he would read much of the state and the sickness of the man. He felt whether the pulse was fast or slow, strong or faint, even or stumbling and uneven, and by long rules and long practice he drew from it his judgments of the fever and the heart. A racing pulse, a fever or a fright, a slow one, a coldness, a sinking of the powers, a faltering one, a danger. This, of all his arts, was perhaps the soundest, the nearest to a true reading of the body. For the pulse does indeed tell much, and we feel it still today for the very same reasons. The old physician, his fingers light upon the wrist, was here on truer ground than with his flask or his stars. He would close his eyes, the better to feel it, and be still and count and judge. The room quiet about him, the candle steady, his 2 fingers resting on the patient's wrist, and the small steady beat, or the troubled one, telling him its quiet tale beneath his touch. There was a calm in it, this laying on of hands, this grave and careful attention. The sick man felt himself truly tended, truly considered, his very life beat weighed and pondered. And in that attention there was comfort, whatever the physician made of what he felt. So he would feel the pulse and study the flask and consult the stars and weigh the humours. And from all of it together he would form his judgment, grave and learned and assured. The wise physician, in his warm, dim study, reading the hidden state of a body by colour and by star and by the beat beneath his fingers. When the physician had made his judgment, he would name the cure, and often it was a herb. For all his talk of stars and humours, much of his actual medicine was the same as the wise woman's, the herbs of the field and the garden, chosen and mixed by the rules of his great books. He had his herbals, the books of plants, each one drawn and named, and its virtues set down, and from them he would choose for this sickness this herb, for that one that, by the old learning. The willow for the fever and the ache, the foxglove, handled with great care, the poppy for the pain. He would write the recipe in his fine hand, the herbs and their measures and the making of them, and it would be carried to the apothecary to be weighed and mixed and made into the draught or the pill. A syrup, perhaps, sweetened with honey, or a powder to be stirred in wine, or a salve, or a plaster. Some of these herbs truly worked, and work still, for we have learned their virtues anew. The willow that holds within it the very thing we take today against the fever and the ache. The foxglove that steadies a failing heart, though it must be given with the greatest care, for it can kill. The old physician did not know the deep how of these. He knew only the long tried that they helped. And so, mixed in with his errors, his stars, and his humours, and his flasks, were these true and working cures. The herb that eased the pain, the herb that brought down the fever, the herb that steadied the labouring heart. So even the learned physician, for all the wrongness of his great system, did sometimes real good. Less, perhaps, by his theory than by the plain herbs he chose, half by chance, half by long wisdom. And the willow bark, steeped into a bitter draught, eased many a fever in that age as it would in ours. To watch the physician at his work was to watch a thing of great gravity and slow ceremony. For when a man of wealth fell sick, the physician was sent for, and came in his fine dark robe, and the whole house would gather and wait and watch as he conducted his careful examination. He would come to the bedside and greet the sick man gravely and ask of his troubles. He would feel the pulse long and thoughtfully, his eyes half closed, in the hush of the room. He would call for the flask and hold it to the light and study the water and frown and consider. He would ask of the man's diet and his sleep and his humour and his habits and his stars. He would consult, perhaps, a small book drawn from his robe, or a chart murmuring over it. And the family would stand by, anxious and hopeful, hanging upon his every learned word. At last, he would give his judgment in grave and measured tones, naming the trouble and its humour, and he would name the cure, the herb, the draught, the bleeding, the diet, the hour for each. And it would be written down, and the apothecary sent for, and the orders given, and the room eased. There was a great comfort in the whole of it, in the gravity and the order and the learning. The sick man and his family felt that all that could be done was being done by a wise and careful hand, and that comfort, that easing of the fear, was itself no small part of the cure. For the physician, whatever the worth of his theory, brought calm and order and grave attention. He turned a frightening sickness into a thing named and understood and met with a settled plan. And the patient, soothed by all this learned ceremony, often rested the easier, and so the better, and so the sooner mended. And now, the physician's long day of consultation and study draws toward its quiet close. The last patient has been seen, the last flask studied, the last grave judgment given and written, and he sits alone in his warm, dim study among his books by the light of a single candle. The great leather-bound volumes stand quiet on their shelves, their brass clasps gleaming faint in the candlelight. The charts of the stars hang still upon the wall. The flask, washed clean, sits empty on the table. And the physician turns the pages of an old book, slowly, reading by the small, steady flame. For he is a scholar still, even at the day's end, and his learning is his life and his delight. He reads of the old masters, of their cures and their reasonings in the warm and bookish quiet. The candle burns low. The ink smell and the leather smell hang soft in the still air of the room. It has been a day of grave and careful work, of judgment and of learning brought to the easing of the sick. Much of it mistaken, we may say now, from our long distance in its theory and its method, and yet given in good faith, with study and with care, and bringing often real comfort and sometimes real cure. He marks his place and closes the heavy book and sits a while in the candlelight, thinking. The town is quiet now. Beyond his window the house is dark, the streets empty, the night come down. And his study holds its warmth and its quiet and its long shelves of patient learning about him. Then he pinches out the candle, and the small flame dies, and the warm dark fills the room. And the wise physician climbs to his rest among his books and his charts and his flasks, the long day's learning done. In a great manor house, in a fine upper chamber, a man lay sick of a fever. He was the lord of the house, and he had taken to his bed 3 days since, and grown worse, and now the whole household moved softly, and spoke low, and tended him through the long, anxious hours. The chamber was warm and dim, the shutters half closed against the light, a low fire in the hearth. The great curtained bed stood in the middle of the room, and in it the sick lord lay, flushed and restless. And about him moved his people, his wife, his servants, and the physician sent for from the town. A basin of water stood by the bed, and cloths for the cooling of the fevered brow. A small table held the draughts and the flasks, the medicines ordered and made and waiting. And the air was close and warm, and smelled of the sickness, and of the herbs strewn to sweeten it. The lady of the house sat by the bed where she had sat for 3 days, watching her husband. She laid the cool cloth on his brow, and changed it when it warmed, and held the cup to his lips. And she watched his face and his breathing for the small signs of mending or of worsening. The fever had risen and fallen, risen and fallen, in the way of fevers 3 days now, and all that could be done was being done: the bleeding, the draughts, the cool cloths, the watching. And now there was only the waiting, the long, slow waiting, to see which way the sickness would turn. The fire settled in the hearth. The shadows hung deep in the corners of the curtained room, and the household kept its watch about the sick lord through the warm and anxious hours. In the dim sickroom of the great manor, where the fever lay heavy and the patient labour of healing went quietly on, the physician judged on the 2nd day that the fever called for a letting of blood, and for so delicate a patient and so tender a treatment, he chose the leeches over the blade. So a jar of them was brought and set by the bed, the small dark creatures sleek in their water. The Lord's arm was bared and laid upon the coverlet, and the physician chose the place. And he lifted a leech from the jar, dark and cool and sluggish, and set it upon the pale skin. The leech cast about a moment, and then fastened and bit, so lightly the sick man scarce stirred. And it began to drink slowly, swelling little by little, drawing the blood from the fevered body. The physician set a 2nd beside it, and a 3rd, each finding its place and fastening and beginning to feed. And the room was quiet, and the leeches drank, and the slow minutes passed in the dim, warm chamber. The lady watched, half in dread and half in hope, as the dark creatures slowly swelled upon her husband's arm. She did not love the sight of them, but she trusted the physician, and she trusted the old cure. And the Lord lay still, and seemed, perhaps, to rest the easier, as the leeches did their slow, quiet work. When they had taken their fill, one by one they loosened and dropped away, fat and dark, and the small wounds bled a while, gently, and were pressed and bound with a clean cloth. And the physician gathered his leeches back into their jar, their work for the day now done. Whether it eased the fever, who can truly say? The fever ran its own course, as fevers will. But the household believed in it, and the sick man rested after, and the cure was thought well given. And the dark leeches, sleek again in their water, were carried away to wait until they should be wanted once more. Beside the leeches, the physician used another old cure upon the fevered lord, the cupping. For this he had a set of small glass cups, rounded and smooth, made for the drawing of the blood to the surface. And by them he meant to draw the ill humours up and out of the deep places of the body. There were two ways of the cupping, the dry and the wet, and he used them both upon the Lord. For the dry, he would warm the inside of a glass cup with a little flame and press it swift upon the skin. And as the warm air within it cooled, it drew, and the glass clung fast, and pulled the flesh up into it. The skin would rise, red and swollen, into the hollow of the cup, the blood drawn up beneath it. And so the cup would sit, clinging for some minutes, drawing the blood and the humours to the place. Then it would be lifted off with a small, soft sound, leaving a round red mark upon the skin. For the wet cupping, the skin was first scratched lightly with a small blade before the cup was set, and then the cup, drawing, would pull a little blood out through the scratches into the glass. So it joined the letting of blood to the drawing of the cup, a double remedy in one. The Lord bore it patiently, the warm glasses pressed along his back and his side, clinging and drawing. It was not a great pain, the cupping, more a strange, tight pulling, and a warmth, and after a soreness. And it left its round red marks upon him, the signs of the cure, fading slowly over the days. Whether it drew out any ill, we may doubt by what we know now of the body. But the warmth of it eased him, and the attention comforted him, and he rested after in the dim room. And the small glass cups were gathered up and wiped and set by, until the physician should call for them again. To bring down the heat of the fever, the physician ordered cooling draughts by the rules of his learning. For the fever was a heat, an excess of the hot and dry, and so it must be met with the cool and the moist. And so the medicines he gave were chosen as cooling things to balance the burning of the blood. There was a syrup of violets, sweet and cool, thought good against the heats of a fever. There was barley water, plain and mild, given to soften and to cool and to quench the dreadful thirst. There were waters of certain herbs and cooling fruits and draughts mixed and sweetened and given by the spoon. The lady would lift her husband's head and hold the cup and coax him to drink a little at a time, and the cool, sweet draught would ease his parched mouth and quench a little his burning thirst. And whether it cooled the fever or no, it eased him and comforted him, and that was something, for much of the good in these draughts was simply that they gave the man drink and rest and ease. A fevered body needs water above all, and the barley water and the cool syrups gave it that. So the cooling draughts, whatever their theory, did this real good at least. They kept the sick man from drying out, and there was comfort in them too, in the sweetness and the coolness and the careful tending. The cup held to the lips, the gentle coaxing, the cool draught easing the dreadful heat of the mouth. The sick lord, parched and burning, found in them a small and real relief, hour by hour. So the draughts were made and given by the spoon and the cup all through the fever's long course. The violet syrup, the barley water, the cool herb waters, given patiently, again and again. And the fevered lord drank, and was eased a little, and the cooling draughts did, in their plain way, their quiet good. On the fourth night, the fever came to its crisis, the turning point, where it would break or it would not. For so the fevers ran, in that age and in any, rising to a height, and then either breaking or carrying the man off. And the household watched that fourth night in dread and in hope for the sign of the turning. The Lord grew very hot and restless, and spoke wild words in his fever, and the lady was afraid. The physician came and felt the pulse and studied the face, and would not say which way it would go. And the long night wore on, the hottest and the worst, the fever at its very height, and the watchers still. Then, in the small dark hours, the change came. The Lord broke out into a great sweat. The fever, at its crisis, turned, and the heat of it poured out of him in a drenching sweat. His brow ran with it, and his linen was soaked, and the dreadful heat began at last to ebb away. The lady felt his brow, and found it, for the first time in days, growing cooler beneath her hand. And his wild words ceased, and his breathing eased, and he fell at last into a true and quiet sleep. The fever had broken, the crisis had passed, and the sick lord had, by the grace of it, come through. What had healed him, in truth, was his own body fighting the sickness through to its end. The cures had eased him and tended him and kept him from the worst, but the mending was his own. The leeches, the cupping, the draughts, the watching, all of it had carried him to the crisis, and there his own strength had turned it. The household wept quietly with relief in the grey of the coming dawn, and the physician nodded, grave and satisfied, and gave order for warm broth and rest and quiet. And the Lord slept on, cool now and easy, the fever gone out of him, drawn back from the very edge. The fever was broken, but the mending was slow, and the careful tending went on for many days. For the sickness had left the Lord weak as a child, pale and thin, and worn down to the bone. And now the work was not to fight the fever, but to build the strength back slowly, day by day. The physician ordered light food, and much of it, broths and soft eggs, and white bread, and a little wine. For the body, having burned itself low in the fever, must now be built up again with good nourishment. And so the lady saw that he was fed a little and often, coaxing him to eat when he had no will to. He slept much in those days, the long, deep, healing sleep of the recovering body, and the household kept the room quiet and warm and dim, that nothing should break his rest. For rest, they knew, was the great healer now, and they guarded his sleep as a precious thing. Each day he was a little stronger. He sat up, after a time, propped on his pillows. He took a little more food and held it down, and the color came back faintly to his cheeks. He spoke and was himself again, weak still, but whole in his mind and mending in his body. The physician came each day and felt the pulse and studied the flask and was content. The cure now was the simplest of all and the soundest. Good food and warmth and quiet and rest. The very things the monks had known and the wise woman, the plain care that lets the body heal. So the Lord mended slowly, surely, through the quiet days in his warm and dim and well-tended chamber. The fever a memory now, the danger past, the strength returning, hour by hour and day by day. And the great house that had held its breath so long breathed easy again, as its lord came slowly back to health. As the lord grew stronger, the physician gave him gentle herbs to aid the slow return of his strength. Not the harsh cures of the fever now, the bleeding and the cupping, but mild and building things, tonics and good herbs and warming spices, to quicken the blood and lift the weary spirit. There was a draught of Bethany, an old and trusted herb, thought good for the head and the heart. There was rosemary to quicken the mind, and sage to strengthen, and a little ginger to warm. And there was, above all, good food made savory with herbs, that he might have the will to eat it. These were the gentlest of medicines, more like good cooking than like physic, and they did their quiet good. For a man who eats well and is warmed, and whose spirit is lifted, mends faster than one who is not. And the herbs, mild and pleasant, did this much at least, and perhaps a little more besides. The lady made him possets, warm drinks of milk curdled with wine and sweetened and spiced, and caudles, thick warm drinks of wine and eggs and herbs, given to the sick to build them up. And he took them gladly now, his appetite returning, and grew the stronger for them day by day. There was pleasure in it now, this tending, where before there had been only dread. For the Lord was mending plainly, and the herbs and the broths were the food of his recovery. And the lady made them with her own hands, and brought them, and watched him take them, glad. So the gentle herbs of recovery did their slow part in the easy days after the crisis. The Bethany and the sage, the ginger and the rosemary, the warm spiced possets and the caudles. Building back, draught by draught and day by day, the strength, the fever had burned away. And now the sickroom, that had been a place of dread, is a place of peace and quiet mending. The Lord sleeps soundly in his great curtained bed, his face calm, his breathing slow and easy. The fever is long gone, the crisis is past, the danger is over, and the household rests. The shutters are open a little now to let in the clean air and the gentle light of the day. The basin and the cloths are put away. The harsh cures are done with, the leeches and the cups. And only the gentle things remain, the broth warming by the fire, the mild herbs upon the table. The lady sits by the bed still, as she has sat all through it, but easy now, and at rest herself. Her long watch is nearly over. Her husband mends, and the worst that she had so feared did not come. She watches his quiet, sleeping face and is glad, and the gladness is a deep and a quiet thing. The fire burns soft and warm in the hearth. The room is still and clean and full of light, and the whole great house that had moved so softly and spoke so low breathes easy once again. The servants go about their work, lighter of step. The fear has lifted from the place. It was a near thing, the sickness, and it might have gone the other way, as so many did. But the cures, such as they were, had tended him and eased him, and his own strength had carried him through, and the slow herbs and the good food and the long rest were building him whole again, day by day. So the sickroom holds its peace now in the gentle light, the Lord asleep and mending. And the lady keeps her quiet, easy watch, while the great house settles into the calm of his recovery. Far from the quiet manor and the herb garden, on the edge of a field of war, there stood a tent. It was the surgeon's tent, set up behind the lines, where the wounded of the battle were brought to be tended. And here, of all the places of medieval healing, the cures were the roughest and the most pressed for time, for war made wounds, terrible wounds, in great number and all at once, and they would not wait. The cut, the pierced, the broken, the burned were carried in and laid down and tended in haste. And the battlefield surgeon of all the healers learned his hard craft fastest and best upon the wounded. The tent was plain, a span of canvas over poles, with a board for a table and the ground for a floor. Within it the surgeon worked, with his tools laid ready, his irons heating, his cloths and his salves to hand. And without, the wounded waited their turn, while the sounds of the distant fighting rolled on across the field. It was grim work and bloody, and there was no time for the slow ceremony of the physician. A wound must be judged in a moment and dealt with in haste, and the next man seen to. Stop the bleeding, draw the arrow or the blade, clean the wound, bind it or burn it, and on to the next. And yet, for all its haste and its horror, much was learned here, and much real good was done. For the surgeon who tended 100 wounds learned more of the body than any book could teach. And the hard cures of the battlefield, born of necessity, were often, in truth, the soundest of the age. So we come, last of all, to this hard place, the tent behind the lines, on the edge of the field, where the wounded were brought, and the surgeon worked in haste, and the brutal cures were the cures that saved. And the irons glowed in the brazier, and the cloths were laid ready, and the next man was carried in. The commonest wound of that warlike age, and one of the hardest to tend, was the arrow's wound. For the arrow drove deep and lodged in the flesh, and could not simply be pulled back the way it came. Its head was barbed, made to catch and to hold, and to draw it out by the shaft alone would tear and ruin. So the surgeon had to work with care, even in haste, to draw the cruel barbed head out whole. He would feel for it and judge how deep it lay, and which way, and how the barbs were set. And then, with his tools, he would draw it, sometimes pushing it on through, sometimes easing it back. There were special tools made just for this, spoons and tongs and clever devices to grip the head. Some would slip down the shaft and cover the barbs, and so let the arrow be drawn without tearing. It was delicate work and skilled, and the great surgeons wrote of it carefully in their books. The man would be held fast and given drink if there was time, for it was a great pain, the drawing, but it must be done, and done well, for an arrowhead left in the flesh would fester and kill. So the surgeon worked, swift and sure, to find the head and grip it, and draw it out whole and clean. And when it was out, the wound must be cleaned and tended, that it should not rot. For the arrow carried filth into the wound, and the wound, untended, would gather and fester. So it was washed and dressed, perhaps with wine, perhaps with honey, and bound and watched. This was hard and skillful work, the drawing of arrows, and the surgeons grew very able at it. For they had, in those warlike years, all too much practice, and they learned, and they wrote it down. And many a man, the cruel barbed head drawn cleanly from him, and the wound well tended, lived, who would have died. The great danger of any wound, the surgeons came to learn, was not always the wound itself, but the rot that came after. For a wound, left dirty, would fester and gather, and the corruption could spread and kill the man. And so the cleaning of the wound was among the most important of all the surgeon's arts. There were old ways, and some of them were wrong, that the surgeons slowly learned to set aside. Some had thought that a wound must form a thick matter to heal, and so left it dirty to do so. But the wiser surgeons came to see that a wound kept clean healed better, and cleaner, and faster. So they washed the wound with wine, which has in it a virtue against the things that spoil a wound, or with vinegar, sharp and stinging, that cleaned and that fought in its way the gathering rot. And some used honey, as the monks did, spread upon the wound to keep it clean and help it close. These were sound cures, though the surgeons knew not the deep why of them, only that they served. The wine, the vinegar, the honey, each in its way kept down the unseen things that fester a wound. And the surgeon, who washed his wounds well and kept them clean, lost fewer of his men to the rot. It was learned the hard way on the battlefield over the long warlike years, wound by wound. This way the man lived, and that way he died, and the surgeons watched and learned and remembered. And slowly, out of all that hard experience, came a sounder and a cleaner way of tending wounds. So the wound was washed and cleaned with wine or vinegar or honey, and the rot kept at bay, and dressed and bound with clean cloth, and changed and watched through the days of its healing. And many a wounded man, his hurt, kept clean by a wise surgeon's care, healed whole, where filth would have killed him. When a great wound bled and would not stop, the battlefield surgeon turned to the harshest cure of all, the fire. For a man could bleed to death from a deep wound in mere minutes, and there was no time and no other way. And so the iron was heated in the brazier until it glowed, and the bleeding was stopped by the burning. It was the same cure the monks had used, but here it was used in haste and in extremity to save a life. The surgeon would press the glowing iron to the bleeding place, swift and firm, to sear the vessels shut, and the blood would stop at once in a hiss and a smell, and the man's life would be saved. It was a dreadful thing and a great pain, and there was little to ease it on the field of war. The man would be held fast by strong hands and bear it as he could, and it was over swiftly. And the bleeding stopped, the iron lifted away, and the seared wound left to heal as it might. It was brutal, plainly, and it left a great scar, and it was a torment to endure. But against the swift and certain death of bleeding, it was a mercy and a true cure, and it worked, for the seared flesh held the blood within, where without the iron the man would have bled white and died. The surgeons did not love the iron, and used the gentler ways where there was time and they would serve. The pressure of the hand, the binding tight, the salve, were tried first, where the wound allowed. But where the great vessel was cut, and the blood came fast, there was the iron, and only the iron. So it glowed in the brazier, ready, through all the long day of the battle and its wounded. The harshest cure, and the most feared, and yet in its hard place, a life-saving one. And many a man bore the dreadful burning and the great scar after, and lived, who without the fire would have died. There was a cruel old practice on the battlefield that a wise surgeon at last set aside and bettered. For it had long been thought that the wounds of war, the gunshot wounds especially, were poisoned, and that they must be treated by pouring boiling oil into them to burn the poison out. It was a torment beyond words, the boiling oil, and it did the wounded man great harm. But it was the practice set down in the books, and the surgeons did it, believing it must be done. Until one day, in the press of a great battle, a surgeon ran out of his oil and had no more to use. And so, for the wounds he could not treat with oil, he made instead a gentle salve, a simple dressing of egg, and oil of roses, and a little turpentine, and laid it on, and bound it. And he passed an anxious night, fearing those men would die, untreated by the burning oil. But in the morning he found a wonder. The men dressed with the gentle salve rested easy and mended, while the men seared with the boiling oil lay in great pain and fevered and did far worse. And so he learned, by chance and by a kind heart, that the gentle way was the better way, and he never used the boiling oil again. And he wrote of what he had learned, that others might know, that the wounds of war were better tended gently with a soft salve than tormented with the fire. It was a great step, this, out of an old cruelty and into a kinder and a sounder cure. So even on the hard field of war, the healing art crept forward, learning, bettering itself. Out of necessity and chance, and the watching of what truly helped the wounded man to mend. And the gentle salve replaced the boiling oil, and the wounded suffered less and healed the more for the change. When a wound was clean and the bleeding stopped, a great wound must often be closed with stitches. For a wound left gaping would heal slowly, if at all, and leave a great and an ugly scar. But a wound drawn together and stitched would knit the faster and the cleaner and heal, the better. So the surgeon had his needles curved, of bronze or of steel, and his thread often of waxed linen or of silk. And he would draw the edges of the wound together, and pass the needle through, and tie the thread, stitch by stitch, along the length of the wound, drawing it closed, and holding it so to heal. It was a great pain, the stitching, with little to ease it, and the man must be held and bear it. But it was swift, and the surgeon was practiced, and it was over, stitch by stitch, soon enough. And the wound, drawn closed and held, would knit beneath the stitches over the days of its healing. Some surgeons used a curious thing in place of thread in certain wounds. The great jaws of ants. They would set a large ant to bite across the wound, its jaws gripping the two edges together, and then nip off the body, leaving the head and the gripping jaws to hold the wound closed like a clasp. It sounds a strange thing, and it was, but it worked, the ant's jaws holding fast and clean. And it was used here and there where the ants were to be had, a small and a clever cure. But mostly it was the needle and the thread, the patient stitching that closed the great wounds of war. So the surgeon stitched, and the wound was closed, and the thread held it firm to heal. And when it was knit, the stitches were drawn out, and the wound was whole, a scar, but closed and sound. And many a great wound, that gaping would have festered and killed, was stitched and held and healed. Let us pause now in the surgeon's tent and think on the strange truth of all these cures. For so many of them, the brutal and the gentle alike, were founded on ideas that were simply wrong. The four humours, the stars, the poison in the wound, the reading of the flask, all mistaken. And yet, again and again, the cures worked, or seemed to, and the sick and the wounded mended. How can this be, that a false idea should yield a cure that helps? It is worth the pausing on. Sometimes it was chance that the herb chosen by a wrong reason happened to be a herb that helped. The willow for the fever, chosen as a cooling thing, that truly does bring down a fever. The honey on the wound, used by old custom, that truly does keep the wound clean and aid its healing. Sometimes it was the body itself, healing as it will, while the cure took the credit beside it. The fever that broke of its own accord, the wound that knit by its own nature, the cold that simply passed. The cure was given and the body mended, and the one was thought the cause of the other. And sometimes it was the care, the plain warm care, that did the good, and not the cure at all. The rest, the warmth, the good food, the easing of the fear, the patient tending hour by hour, these that came with every cure were often the true healers, whatever the cure was thought to be. So the brutal cures somehow worked by chance, and by the body, and by the care that came with them. Wrong in their reasons, often, and yet right, here and there, in their results, and not to be wholly scorned. For the people of that age, with so little to go on, found, by long looking, much that genuinely helped and held to it. And so, in the surgeon's tent, behind the lines, the wounded were tended, one by one, through the long day. The arrows drawn, the wounds cleaned, the bleeding stopped, the great hurts stitched and bound. And many of them, though we might not think it, by these rough and hasty cures, lived. It was no gentle place, and no clean one, and many died there too, beyond any saving. But many lived, who without the surgeon's hard, swift work would surely have died upon the field. The man who was bleeding, the iron stopped. The man whose arrow was drawn whole. The man whose wound was stitched. They were carried out when they were tended to lie and to mend in whatever shelter there was. And there they were watched, and their wounds were changed, and the rot was kept at bay where it could be. And slowly the ones who were to live grew stronger, and their wounds closed, and they healed. Hard men, made harder by their hurts, bearing their great scars, the marks of the surgeon's saving work. The scar of the cautery, the line of the stitches, the puckered mark where the arrow had been drawn, each one a sign of a brutal cure and of a life that the brutal cure had saved. It is a strange thing to honor, perhaps, the rough work of the battlefield surgeon. And yet there was a real skill in it, and a real mercy, and a real good for all its blood and haste. He took the broken men in the worst of their hour, and he mended what could be mended, and saved who could be saved. So the wounded who lived bore witness in their scars and their mended limbs to the surgeon's hard art. The brutal cures that somehow worked, given swift and plain in the tent behind the lines, and went home when the wars were over, scarred but living, to their villages and their fields by the grace of a rough and a skillful hand. And now the long and dreadful day upon the field of war comes, at last, to its end. The fighting has died away with the failing light, and the wounded have all been brought in and tended, and the surgeon's tent grows quiet in the dusk, the day's hard work behind it now. The irons cool in the dying brazier, the bloodied tools are wiped and gathered and set by. The salves are stoppered, the cloths folded, the needles and the threads laid away in their place. The surgeon, weary beyond words, sits at last upon a stool, his hands red and aching, and rests. He has worked since the dawn, without pause, over the broken bodies of the field. He has drawn arrows and stopped bleeding and stitched wounds and eased the dying. And he is spent and grieved for those he could not save, and quietly glad for those he could. Outside the tent, the wounded who were tended lie now in their shelters, resting, mending, or slipping away. And the great field that rang all day with the dreadful sounds of battle lies silent under the first stars. The smoke drifts thin across it. The night comes down, kind at last, over the wounded and the still. The surgeon closes his eyes a while on his stool in the quiet of his emptied tent. Tomorrow there will be more, the wounds to be tended again, the dressings changed, the long care of the mending. But for now there is only the dusk and the rest, and the day's hard mercies done. And the tent grows dark, and the brazier dims, and the long day of brutal cures is over. And the surgeon rests behind the silent field, his rough and saving work laid down until the morning. And so, all across that distant age, the day's healing is done, and the cures are put away. In the monastery infirmary, the honey is stoppered, and the cautery iron set cool by the hearth, and the patient brother makes his last round of the beds, lamp in hand, and finds all quiet. In the wise woman's cottage, the green salve is covered, and the herbs straightened on their strings. And the old woman banks her fire, and sits a while in the warm dark, her long day's tending done. In the barber-surgeon's shop, the bright tools hang clean upon the wall, and the striped pole hangs still. In the physician's study, the great books are closed, and the flask washed clean and set by, and the candle is pinched out, and the warm dark fills the room of patient learning. In the manor sickroom, the Lord sleeps soundly, mending, and the lady keeps her easy, grateful watch. And in the surgeon's tent, behind the silent field, the bloody tools are wiped and laid away. And the weary surgeon rests, his hard day's mercies done, the brazier dimming into dark. All across the land, the healers lay down their work, and their cures, and their long day's care, the herbs and the honey, the lances and the leeches, the flasks and the irons, and the bright sharp blades. All of it set by now, in its place, in the quiet, until the morning calls it forth once more. For there will always be the sick to tend, and the hurt to mend, and the patient work to be taken up again. But for now, the cures are put away, and the long day of healing rests, and a great quiet settles over the infirmary and the cottage, the shop, and the study, and the tent. And all the healers and all the healed sink slowly toward their rest in the gathering dark. In the monastery infirmary, the man with the honeyed wound sleeps soundly through the night. His hurt is dressed and clean, and the soreness has eased, and he rests beneath his rough grey blanket. The honey does its slow, quiet work upon him, and beneath the linen, the torn flesh knits itself whole. In the manor house, the Lord sleeps too, cool now, the fever gone, mending in his great curtained bed. His wife sits by him still, but easy, watching his calm, sleeping face in the soft glow of the fire. And his breathing is slow and even and deep, the long healing sleep of the body come back from the edge. In the village, the child whose chest the wise woman eased sleeps quiet beside its mother. The cough is loosened, the breathing easy, the small body warm and resting under the poultice's care. And in another cottage, the sleepless soul has drunk the lavender draught and sunk at last into rest. All of them sleeping now, the tended and the mended, in their beds across the quiet land. The cures, brutal or gentle, done with for the day, their work now past to the body's own slow healing. And the body heals best in sleep, as the old healers knew, though they could not have said why. So the patients sleep, and the healing goes on within them, quiet and unseen and sure. The wound knitting, the fever cooled, the chest eased, the strength returning, breath by breath, the deep work of the mending body going on softly in the dark, while the tended ones rest. And there is something in it that draws the eyes heavy and the breathing slow, to think on. All those sleeping patients, long ago, mending in the quiet dark, tended and safe and at rest. And the gentle, patient healing of the body going quietly on, through the long and peaceful night. And as the dark deepens, a quiet thought drifts through the warm stillness. That this work, this old patient work of mending the sick and easing the hurt, is older than any of them, older than the monastery, older than the wise woman's cottage, older than all the cures we have spoken of. For as long as there have been people, there have been the sick and those who tended them, the hand laid on the fevered brow, the herb gathered for the ache, the wound washed and bound, the long patient care of one human creature for another, in pain and in need, and in the dark. The cures have changed across the centuries and changed again, and will change on after us. The honey and the leeches gave way to other things, and those will give way in their turn. But the wish beneath them does not change at all. The wish to ease a suffering, to mend a hurt, to heal, it ran through the patient brother in his infirmary, and the old woman by her fire. It ran through the surgeon in his tent, and the physician among his books, and the lady at the bedside. And it runs on still, the same long thread, through all who tend the sick, even now, even tonight. There is nothing here to solve, and nothing to put right. It is only a thing to notice and to rest in. That long, soft thread of human care, running back through all the centuries and forward past us, on, the oldest and the kindest of all our works, the tending of one another in the night. And it asks nothing of you now in the quiet, but that you let it carry you gently toward your rest. Like a cool hand on a fevered brow, like a low voice in a dim room, like a warm draught at the day's end. The long, patient kindness of all the healers, reaching across the years to settle you now softly into sleep. In the monastery infirmary, the patient brother's lamp burns low now, no more than a small steady flame. He has kept his watch through the dark hours by the dying fire among his sleeping sick, and now his own eyes grow heavy, and his head nods, and the long night draws toward its end. The flame leans and flickers and shrinks down, golden and small, in the great quiet dark of the hall. The sleeping sick breathe slow, and even all about him tended and resting and safe. The herbs hang still on their strings. The fire glows red and low. The night is deep and kind and still. And one by one, all across the land, the last lamps of the healers gutter low, and dim. In the cottage, in the study, in the shop, in the tent, the small flames sink toward the dark. The long day's healing done, the cures put away, the tended ones asleep, the healers at their rest. There is the faint red glow of embers, here and there, and the small last flames, and then less, and the great soft dark comes down, gentle and complete, over all the sleeping land, over the infirmary and the cottage, the manor and the shop, the study and the silent field, and the last lamp leans and flickers once more, and with a small soft breath goes out. The dark is whole now, and warm and still, holding all the sleepers close within it, and only the quiet sound of breathing remains, slow and even, all through the peaceful night. The healers sleep, the healed sleep. The long thread of care rests until the morning, and the warm dark holds it all, gently, and there is nothing now but rest, and the quiet, and the deep, still night. And so the night goes on, as it has for centuries. The herbs are stopped, the lamps are out, the cures are all put away, and the sick lie sleeping, tended and safe, mending quietly in the warm and gentle dark. The fires burn low, the land sleeps, and perhaps by now, so do you. If you are still awake, that is perfectly fine. There is nowhere you need to be, nothing you need to do. The old work of healing can wait until morning, as it always has. Let it rest, let everything rest. The archive will be here tomorrow night, as always. Sleep well.